Hi, I'm Charles Feldman.
And my name is Ela Edgar, and we're here for another episode of Trust on Purpose. And Charles, what have we got on our slate today?
We have an interview with a gentleman named Kevin Eikenberry, who has written a number of books, but he has a new book out called Flexible Leadership. And I'm going to actually ask Kevin I'm going to turn over to Kevin for a moment and ask you to introduce yourself. Tell our listeners a little bit about your background and yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Eikenberry, and I'm the Chief Potential Officer of the Kevin Eikenberry Group, which is a leadership and learning training company based in Indianapolis, Indiana, with a team spread out across the United States. And we're in the business of helping leaders reach their potential and make the world a better place.
Great. And, well, we're going to talk a lot about your book and what's in it. So at the end, we'll ask you to give our listeners an information about where they can find the book, how they can get it, and all that good stuff. So this is great. I'm looking forward to it. So do you want to just jump right in?
I'm ready if you guys are.
Fantastic.
Interesting question, Kevin. So I'm going to say, as soon as you talked about flexibility, I immediately noticed how tightly I'm holding and constricting in my core. And your question was, why is that? And that's funny because what comes to mind immediately is the tighter I hold it, the more control I have over it.
So say more.
There's definitely some uncertainty in my next couple of weeks. Some of it's really big and a bit scary. And so, I feel like there's a part of me subconsciously that if I hold on to it tight, then I can control what the outcome may be. And if I hold on to it even tighter, I can disconnect and disassociate. And there's no flexibility, right?
And I would actually argue's the wrong word. I would actually comment that the way to deal with uncertainty is to allow yourself to flex.
Yeah. So this piggybacks onto something that I've been focused on more and more, and it's the concept of surrender. And surrender, I thought, was basically, if either of you look at tarot cards or anything, there's a picture of a hanging man in some tarot decks. And it is quite literally an invitation to surrender to life. And he is hanging by the sail of a ship on the mast, hanging upside down like this. And that concept terrifies me because I don't know what I'm surrendering into. However, a lovely meditation this week gave me a different analogy about surrender is like a river with a big rock in the middle. And the river and the water doesn't try and go over the rock or through the rock or straddle the rock. It simply flows around. And so I think what you're inviting me to consider in this moment, that flexibility actually feels like in partnership with the surrender. So I can flow around. I don't have to push a rock uphill. I don't have to resist it.
Well, it's going to come anyway. Like whatever's going to come is going to come, right?
It's going to come.
So resisting it is somewhat futile, really.
Yes. Yeah.
Resistance is futile.
Okay.
Did
Let's try
somebody
not to be
smart say
cliche
that?
here, Charles.
But you've written a book about this. And so in your experience, in times of uncertainty and in your experience working with leaders, do you feel that they're more likely to be rigid, holding, trying to control? I guess maybe the question is actually, what do you see in leaders?
Well, I work hard to avoid overgeneralizing, right? So I do think there are a couple of things that leaders often do. And let's start here as to why this is. Leaders have gotten promoted to wherever they are, whether those of you listening are a frontline leader or have been leading for a very long time and in several different roles, and you got promoted because you were good at something, and you got promoted because you had answers. And it's hard not to believe that one of the reasons you got promoted is because you had right answers. And so that's part of our identity as leaders. And I say that in a careful and non-judgmental way. Like, I just think that's true. It's very easy in times of uncertainty for leaders to do really one of three things. To feel like they have to have the answers, so they proclaim it. To just bull forward, which could be related to that or not. Like, we're just going to try to put our blinders on and ignore it, and here we go. Or they become immobilized by it.
Yeah.
And chances are, in most cases, none of those are probably the perfect or best answer. And I really want to go back to something that you said that I think is really at the crux of one of the big ideas in the book, is that when we think we have to be right, we don't have to always be right. And in fact, that's not always the right goal. I'll put it that way, right? We grew up in school and we were taught 2 + 2 =, and Christopher Columbus discovered America and here's how chlorophyll works. I don't know, like photosynthesis, like, I don't know, like, don't ask me to explain photosynthesis. But my point is, there were right answers. And then we came up as an individual contributor and became leaders, and there were right answers. And we got, as I said a minute ago, we got promoted because we had a lot of the right answers. And now we feel like, not only do we feel like maybe we ought to, but like that's supposedly the job. And in a world of 30 years ago, when there was more things that were clear, when a best practice was a good way to think about the world, when what I would call, when the context was clear and we had clear cause and effect and all those sorts of things, then right answers were pretty useful. But I think now what leaders need to be thinking about is, what are the range of possible good answers?
Mm-hmm.
Or, stated a slightly different way, what's the best answer given our context, based on the information that we have, which chances are isn't everything we wish we had. That's the definition of uncertainty. How do we navigate that rather than being immobilized by it or bowling through it, forcing for the right answer? Because here's the thing, when we try to find the answer, almost always we will get a bunch of unintended consequences that won't be clear until sometime later, and maybe might not be clear for a long time because the world's complex.
Yes. And along with that, there are a couple of things that come up for me as I listen to that. That's wonderful. One is, if I believe that I should know the answer, then that precludes my ability to learn or to be curious.
It precludes my ability to be curious, which means if I think I should, Charles, to your first point, then I put the pressure on me and I don't ask anybody else, not necessarily because I don't want help, but I kind of think I'm not supposed to. Like, it's supposed to be my job to figure it out. Like, that's why I'm getting paid my salary to do that. And I will respectfully say to people, even though I started out by saying, I understand why that may be why you're there, how's that working for you?
Exactly. And the other thing that comes up for me as you talk about this is that often the belief is, yes, I'm here because I know I'm supposed to know the answer. And on top of that, that's what my people's trust in me is built on, is that I'm the guy who knows the answer. I'm the woman who knows the answer, which in fact, especially when the answer doesn't work out well, the trust breaks pretty quickly there. So if I go out instead and say, I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure, I'm curious about this, I may not have the answer, probably don't have the answer, and begin to ask around, that actually counterintuitively builds trust.
Well, 100%, right? Without question. I would say that the key here isn't even to frame it. I mean, I know that we got here by talking about a question and having an answer, but I think it helps us as leaders to not frame it as an answer, but what are the perspectives that will help us see this complex situation more clearly, even though we may not get to complete clarity. That's okay. That's the way the world is. The world is more interconnected and more complicated and complex than ever. Fine. What that means is the more perspectives we can bring to the table, the better. And there's no one that has all the perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's easier for us as humans/leaders to let go of the idea that we have all the perspectives than to say, well, I'm supposed to have the answer. Because again, answer goes back to school. 2 + 2, 4 divided by 2, right? That kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about Amy Edmondson's latest book, The Science of Failing Forward. And anyway, she talks about, as a leader, declaring, we've never been in this situation before. And so collectively, I actually need all of your perspectives because no one of us can solve this on our own, right? And so inviting and actually declaring, like, we've never been in a situation like this before, so how could we possibly know the answer?
So what are the range of plausible answers? What are a set of options that we could consider? I like to think of what I call, and I think I made this up. Like if someone can say this is already out there, then I will say that I heard it somewhere and don't remember. But I call it plausible cause analysis. Like what are the plausible reasons something happened or plausible reasons why this is the situation? So like I will often in a workshop with leaders say, okay, have you ever been in a situation where you ask a question of a group and you get nothing? You get no responses. And I know where people's heads go. They go to negative intent. Like, why don't they care? They're not paying any attention. I said, but what are the plausible reasons? And with any kind of group of any size, we can come up with about 10 reasons why people didn't say something right away, including their thinking and a whole bunch of others, most of which are of benign intent at worst.
Yeah.
And so my point is, if I now know that there are 10 plausible things here, I don't have any idea which it is. But if I, same in any kind of situation, if I've got 10 things that it might be, what could we do that would address more of them? If we did this thing, it would address 4 or 5 of them. That's a better shot than without having thought about any of that. We still don't know, but we're improving our odds. Listen, as leaders, we are in the influence business. We can influence other people, but we can't control them. We can also influence outcomes, but we can't control outcomes. So the question is, how can we improve our ability to have influence that might get us a good result?
So when you work with people, when you talk with people about this, what are the responses? What do you hear from people? What do you get back?
Well, I think a lot of people say, well, being flexible is really good for everybody else, but like I have a way I do it. Like I think that's the first. So I think there are 2 things. No one disagrees intellectually with the idea of being flexible as a leader. I haven't really found anyone that disagrees with it intellectually, but I see a whole lot of people that have a hard time thinking about actually doing it for themselves for a variety of reasons. But I think it's important for us to identify something because this is a podcast and you guys are experts in trust. And Charles, you and I have had conversations about trust and how to build it and all those sorts of things in the past. And I would say that perhaps some of you listening are thinking, well, how can a leader be flexible? Even though they like that idea in concept, how can they be flexible how do I trust them if I don't know what they're going to do? How do I trust them if they're not being consistent, if they're not being stable, if I don't know what to expect? So if you'd like, I could share a metaphor as to how to look at that, I think.
Oh, yeah, please.
I would love that. Please do.
Okay. So I can look outside of my office window right now and see a tree. And you may not, wherever you are, you may not be able to see one, but you can see one in your mind's eye. Like I'm not talking about a young tree. I'm talking about a tree that's been around for 20, 30, 40 or more years. It's stable. It's strong. It's sturdy. It's consistent. It's not moving. It's right there. It's rooted. And yet you don't have to look at that tree for very long. If there's any kind of breeze at all, and you find out that that same thing that is stable and consistent and solid and known is also flexible. Like one of the synonyms for flexible is pliant. And a tree is that. But it's not only that. So when we say, how can I be trustworthy? And how can I build trust if I'm flexible? And I would say, this isn't an either or conversation. Leaders must be rooted in their values and their principles and the mission of their organization and what they're trying to accomplish. Like that's what we're rooted in. And we need to be, I believe, flexible in our approach into what we actually do in every moment or in different as the context dictates that we do or that we might do something differently. So the idea here is that consistent and flexible are not opposites, but they're 2 ideas that are symbiotic in that we hold them in tension. And that when we hold them in tension, then we can say, which direction should I lean? This is what I would call a flexor, or it's the idea of a flexor. Which direction in the situation that I find myself, which direction should I be leaning? Because the ends of that flexor, the ends of that continuum, the far ends are very unlikely to be the best answer. The better answer is somewhere in between. And the context will tell us where in between we ought to be.
Can you share how you define flexibility in a leadership context?
Yeah, in the leadership context, Being a flexible leader means that, number one, that I am intentional about recognizing that I can't necessarily do things the way I've always done them or the way I'm most comfortable doing them or what my style tells me. So flexibility as a leader starts with intention. It then is about the context. What does the situation tell me? And then being willing to flex to best address that context.
Ooh, something came up for me as you said that. You said it starts with intention. And I wonder, though, what you said earlier of being clear on values and being the values not only personally, but values for the organization and all of that. And that's part of knowing oneself. So even perhaps, love to hear your thought on this, even before intention is understanding, knowing myself well, knowing what I'm rooted in.
As the more we are self-aware and the more self-knowledge that we have, the better chance we have to be a more effective leader. And one of the things I'm suggesting here is that understanding ourselves well enough to know that we have natural tendencies that we may have actually made part of our identity. This is how I lead. This is how I do it.
Yeah.
I am an XYZ leader. I'm an ENFP. I have these 4 strengths. I mean, I could go right on down. And I'm not picking on any of those instruments or styles. That's not the point. The point is they're useful until they're not, and they're not useful when they become our identity. And so people haven't spent enough time in self-reflection if they're just saying, well, this is the kind of leader I am. And so I'm suggesting, even if we don't deeply understand that for ourselves, we have to at least recognize that that identity in and of itself is oversimplifying the world and oversimplifying the possible range of our responses. And I don't have to go into therapy or go further back than that. I just have to recognize, say, okay, what I've come to believe or even just what my natural habits are. Like, this is my learned response. When this happens to me in a meeting, this is what I do. Is that always serving you? And I would suggest probably not.
Yeah.
Let's just take the simplest of contexts. I'm in a meeting with my team, who have all been on our team, most of the people, for many years. And the shortest time anyone's been there's a year. Might I need to respond differently with that group of people than with another group of people? Well, we can very easily say, well, sure. And yet most leaders don't. And that's the basic point here. We have to say, okay, I have to be aware enough to say, stop, and don't go into instant automatic response and say, what does the context tell me? And might there be a way that would get me better results here?
Right.
In the trust framework that we use, one of the 4 dimensions of trust is sincerity, which is integrity and honesty. And part of that is, of course, being consistent, right? So if I say something to you and then I go say something to Ela, they should at least be reasonably consistent. Otherwise, we begin to...
Yeah, agreed.
And so I wonder, for a leader who's trying to be trustworthy in that way, how they would also hold this idea of they're not going to be the same in these 2 different contexts that you just mentioned, this meeting with its team that they've worked with for, a bunch of years, and maybe a customer.
But sorry, I was just to say, but we're not doing massive pendulum swings here, right?
I think that's the point. Yeah.
And so I think, what I love about this knowing ourselves and this self-awareness is we're often actually just looking for tiny tweaks and nuances, not big sweeping changes in how we are with team versus customer. But again, to our point is that it takes awareness and then intention about going into this particular setting. What's the outcome? How am I best going to arrive at that outcome? How can I best frame this? How can I support the people in this conversation to get there?
Because what's not changing is where we're trying to get to.
Right.
What's not changing is here's the outcome we're searching or striving for. And so what is changing is the approach that we might need to take, or maybe only tweak, and maybe different with this group right now when they're feeling that uncertainty than it might be with them a week from now when they're less so. And so absolutely, I think that's right.
Which takes capacity to observe the context well. So be a really good observer of the context of a situation.
You know,
Mhm.
I say somewhere relatively early in the book that I believe that being a more flexible leader is the path to being a more effective leader, but it is not an easy path. It's far easier for us to lean into our natural response. Right. I'm fundamentally saying, consider your natural response and decide if that's the right answer or the best answer right now or not. Is that going to get you the result that you most want right now or not? So there's the effort of the self-awareness. There's the effort of that intention of stopping, even if only for a breath, the natural response. Right. And then there's, Charles, to your point, being not just willing to, but able to observe the context. And in the book, we give people a framework to help think about that as well.
I was just going to say, that would be really valuable for a leader, for someone who's leading, for me, when I'm in a leadership context, to have a framework for reading the context.
Ilya, you had a question about context, so is now the time to ask it?
Yeah, well, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and of course in reference to the book, but how do you help leaders start to look at context in a more intentional way?
Well, again, I think intention is a big part of it because we tend to, left to our own devices, treat everything like what we've seen before. And I think our world isn't necessarily quite like it's been before. So I like to use a admittedly somewhat simplified version of the work of Dave Snowden with what is called the Kevin framework. And you guys are familiar with that. I see one nodding head.
No,
Oh.
I don't. Yay. I get to learn.
We gotta
Yeah,
talk
I'm
about that
sorry.
one.
You need to have a conversation about that, but let me just do
Okay,
it in a very
okay.
high level.
Okay.
And again, I am oversimplifying it on purpose at this moment. But the Kevin framework basically says it's a map is what it is. So imagine if I put you in the wilderness and say, your job is to leave, to get out of here. Your first thing was, where's the map? I need to know where I am so I know where to go. And that's the idea of making sense, or the sense-making idea of this Kevin framework, which says basically there are four sort of domains in which our context might lie. And they're fuzzy at the edges, and there's all sort of stuff. But just for our purposes right here are the four. It is, the context is clear, the context is complicated, the context is complex, or the context is chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned earlier on that I think most of us act as if it's clear, that the context is clear, that the knowns are known, that cause and effects are clear, that someone's got the answer, that best practices can reign. And in some situations, that is fantastic, phenomenal, and awesome. But that's not the whole world all the time. And it's less of the world than it used to be. In a world that is more global and more interconnected and more messy than ever, that's not always the context of our work. And yet most of us continue to happily, blissfully, being blissfully unaware, operate in that context. So I went around, if you envision this as a map, everybody, I started at the bottom right and I went around sort of counterclockwise. But what I want to do is slide over to the last one I said, which was chaos, or a chaotic context. And here's what I think happens, is that we tend to think about the world as if things are either clear or they're chaotic. In fact, we use the word chaos all the time. And Snowden would say, and I would agree with him, that chaotic context is specific and relatively infrequent. And that much of what we call chaos is probably complex, might only be complicated. But here's what complex is. Complex is there are things we don't know, and we don't know them, and there's some other things we don't even know we don't know. It's like, it's the true uncertainty thing, right? Like, I don't even know. We don't even know what all the levers are. So I'll give you a simple example. Well, it's not a simple example, but it's a one that all of us have experienced in the last few years. As we were having this conversation, it was almost 5 years ago that a pandemic started to sweep the world, Europe, and then the US, and we sent everybody home, and everyone had to work from home. And that, at the start of that, over a 2 or 3 week, 4 week period, chaos. And what did we need? We needed someone to say, we're going to do this. Might not even be right, but we got to do something. And that's what we did. And we did that at the governmental level, and we did that at the organizational level. In a chaotic context, that's what we need. Someone needs to do something, because otherwise we are totally unable to move. And so we look to a leader, and a leader can play the role, say, let's go here. Now, we might have to change it later. And that happened a lot, right? Early in the pandemic, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Okay, but we had to do something. But what's happened since then? Well, we sent everybody home, and then the medical part of it calmed down, and we realized that we could actually be together, and we could actually bring people back to the office. And then people started bringing people back to the office. And now, again, as we're having this conversation, there's more and more talk about bringing people back, return to office the way it was before. And I don't want to get into conversation about why that is necessarily. I think there's all sorts of reasons, some useful and some not, but I think all understandable, because what's happening is people are trying to say, let's just put it back to the way we understood it. The context is clear again. Let's just do it like that. But what's happened is what? All kinds of unintended consequences. So we set a policy, which is a good thing to do when the context is clear. But a policy is not a good thing to do when things are complex, because all the dominoes will fall in all these different directions. And we wonder where we were left. Like 2 years ago or so, I was telling people, think pilot, not policy. And in a context, what we need are to try stuff, to experiment, to be curious and then try stuff. Let's see if this works. If this works, it's great. If it doesn't, then we can go back in another direction. And we're making decisions that we can change, like we can change our clothes. We can do this, then we can change. Or we'll put on a coat. No, we'll take the coat off. We'll put on a sweatshirt. No, we can make changes to that. We try something, not quite what we want. We can make an adjustment. And yet that's not what leaders usually want to do.
Right. They want to make a policy.
That's not the way many of us that have as much gray hair as I have were brought up necessarily. And again, no disrespect to what's happened in the past, but the world is different now. The world is more complicated and complex than it ever was before.
Okay, I need a tiny little clarification. In the model, what's complicated?
So complicated is, you know what? I don't have all the information, but I'll bet most of the information is available. So we need to have expert opinions. We need to have a variety of perspectives. And while we may not be able to get complete clarity, we can come a lot closer. There are things we know we don't know, and we can go try to figure them out, or at least get some guesses, some plausible options, which is easier to deal with than full-on complexity. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. Now, there are downsides to all those things, right? Like if once we can lean into the expertise too much, or like we can assume someone has that expertise, whether it's us or somebody else. And again, that's where we get in trouble sometimes with that right answer stuff. Well, I'm the boss. Here's the right answer. Here we go. Well, I had blind spots, and that's what kept me from understanding all of this. If I'd have known all of what I know now, I have made a different choice. Like we say that all the time. You want the simplest way? This is not in the book. And now, Charles, you've written your book like 7 times, and it keeps getting better every time. Longer.
Slightly longer.
But better. I know. We've had this conversation. But my point is this. Like, here, what I'm about to say is not in the book because I wasn't smart enough to have it in there, but it would be if I was doing it again. If you've ever, as a leader, been in a situation where someone asks you a question, or you ask yourself a question, and your answer is, it depends. Like, if you're aware enough to know that it depends, it's not clear.
Yeah.
It's either complicated or complex. And when you hear it depends, the next question, if you're coaching someone or you're in a meeting and someone says it depends, well, what does it depend on?
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Let's talk about those possibilities, those plausible things.
Yeah. I'm thinking this might be close to a good place to wrap, but what I guess I want to say at this point, or ask you, Kevin, is we've talked a lot about some of the basic concepts that you write about in this book. And listening to you talk about it, it sounds like this is really a powerful book for any leader and valuable book for any reader to be using those concepts. Is there anything else out of your book that you think would be valuable for our listeners to hear in the context of trust or maybe even otherwise?
Yeah. Oh, so first of all, thanks for the kind words. And I would say this, that, yeah, we have sort of dipped into some of the biggest ideas, and the formula of intention plus context plus flexors equals flexible leadership. The book is organized at a meta level on 3 points, which I think are really important. And those are mindset, skill set, habit set. So if there's something we haven't talked much about, it's about the habit set. But it is to say that our current habit is to not be intentional, right? Is to just do what comes natural, what we've done 52 times before, whatever. So what I try to do in the book is help people see. I mean, the conversation we've had today helps you to see the landscape and help to understand the big picture here, and that we have to think about this tensions between things rather than picking one end or the other, and that the world is much more of a both and than an either or world, and those sorts of things. So understand, because if people don't get that or don't buy that, it doesn't matter what the skills are, because they're not going to match for them, and there's not going to be any chance that they'll take any action. So mindset has to match the skill set, but if the skills sit in the tool chest and become dusty and rusty, what's the point? So the last part of the book talks about how do you start to operationalize some of these things for yourself and for your organization. And so that's sort of the overall arc of the book, if you will. And it's been great to have this conversation with you guys. I've enjoyed it a great deal.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really appreciated it as well.
So one of the things before we wrap, actually, there's two things. One, thank you. My mind is spinning, thinking about different leaders that I'm currently working with and how this will be so valuable for them. So thank you. And part two is, how can people find you? Where would you like people to connect with you? Tell us about that part.
So the book is Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. And probably the easiest way, I mean, if you want to buy a book, you can obviously go to Amazon. You can find it, and that'd be awesome, or wherever it is that you buy books, right? If you go to flexibleleadershipbook.com, you'll get all sorts of information about the book. But I want to actually give you two things and you can certainly connect with me on LinkedIn, all this sorts of stuff. You can find me and our work at kevineikenberry.com. But I want to give everybody two things. Number one, if you're intrigued by this, and if you're interested in thinking about how I can start to do this, I would suggest you not buy one book, but buy two. And here's why. Because if you buy two books, you can give one to someone else, and then you can go on this journey together. And you have a much better chance of success when you have a thought partner, when you have a peer learner, a peer coach, whatever, however you want to frame that. And I strongly encourage you to do that. I know you're saying, well, Kevin, you want to sell two books instead of one. And that's true. But I believe that with all my heart to be true, that you will get far more from this if you take action on it. And the best way to take action on it is to do it with a partner. So you can go to kevineikenberry.com/buy2, the number two, the numeral two, kevineikenberry.com/buy2. You'll find that option at the other link I gave you, but you can do that. But here's the other thing. For all of you that listened, I have a gift for you. And the gift is at kevineikenberry.com/gift. And if you go there, the thing about the book, the idea in the book that we haven't talked about it really at all is confidence. And so when you go to kevineikenberry.com/gift, what I have for you is a gift of the masterclass I created about building confidence in ourselves and others. And we sell it every day for $79, but not for all of you. All you have to do is go and download it for free. And when you're on that page, there's other stuff about the book as well. So if you go to kevineikenberry.com/gift, kevineikenberry.com/buy2, it's a good place to start.
Fantastic.
That, you just made my heart burst. One of my values is generosity. And so I feel the generosity of what you've just shared. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's really lovely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us, for sharing so generously. I loved this conversation. Charles, any closing words from you?
Yeah, I just want to extend my thanks as well. This has been a really interesting and motivating conversation. And yes, I am going to go take advantage of the buy two books and share one with someone else.
I love that.
And work through it with someone else. That sounds like a great way to use this material.
Yeah.
So thank you. And we'll check in with you again in a while and see how things are going, what you're finding out as people read the book and spread it around.
I love that.
Get back to you. So yeah, that'd be fun.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
On behalf of both Charles and myself, we want to say a big thank you to our producer and sound editor, Chad Penner, Hillary Rideout of Inside Out Branding, who does our promotion, our amazing graphics, and marketing for us. And our theme music was composed by Jonas Smith. If you have any questions or comments for us about the podcast, if you have a trust-related situation that you'd like us to take up in one of our episodes, we'd love to hear from you at trust@trustonpurpose.org.
And we'd also like to thank you, our listeners. Take care and keep building trust on purpose. Until next time.
Until next time.